The following is CKUW 95.9 FM original spoken word programming created by volunteers in the community, made possible by generous listener support.
Live from downtown Winnipeg at the University of Winnipeg, it's CKUW, listener-driven radio, 95.9 FM, and this is Rogue Primate. And welcome to Rogue Primate for another wonderful Monday. You might be expecting to hear Inner City Voices. Well, they've yielded half an hour of their show today to Rogue Primate, your ecology and ecopolitics, resistance, and biodiversity positive show. I'm Alon, your host, and we'll be doing the full hour from 5 to 6 today. And next Monday you can hear Inner City Voices occupying the full slot. It's an alternating hour-long sequence we're going to be starting in January full-time, where you get 1 hour of each of our shows on an alternating basis. So we come in every 2 weeks with a more detailed show. And on today's show, we'll be talking about the push to increase the pork industry again in Manitoba. It's like 1999 all over again. And I'll be speaking with blogger, journalist, and activist Larry Powell. His website is planetinperil.ca. We'll get him on the phone in just a few moments, talking about pork, talking about its impacts on the environment, talking about the treatment of animals, talking about the economics of the pork industry being subsidized by government, and about the use of antibiotics, which is a global crisis, according to Larry, and he'll elaborate a lot more when I get him on the phone. And my guest today is Larry Powell. Larry, are you there?
Hello, Alon. I sure am.
Hi, Larry. Hope we're not going to run your phone bill through the roof. If so, you send the receipt to CKUW, but we're happy to get you on the phone.
Okay.
For those who don't know Larry, I don't know him too well, but Larry's, where are you based in Manitoba, Larry?
Well, we live in Shoal Lake. Just moved here recently, so that's where I live now.
That's, for people who aren't familiar with the province, is that up in the Duck Mountain area, or whereabouts?
Generally speaking, it's just on the Yellowhead Highway west of Neepawa.
Excellent. And you said you once lived in Neepawa as well, that whole area you must know
right, yeah.
Pretty well?
I just moved from Neepawa about a month ago, yes.
Excellent. Now, Larry, you've been a blogger, freelance journalist, an activist. You're pretty aware of the environmental situation in Manitoba. Your website is planetinperil.ca?
Yes, that's correct. And, I cover mostly environmental issues, and I write a lot of articles specializing in agriculture and the environment.
Okay, yeah, and specifically the hog industry is something I said in my intro. Not sure if you were catching that up there. Probably don't get the signal, but you'd get it live online. That, to me, it feels like 1999 all over again when the NDP first came in 99, that's when I first became active in environmental issues, and it was the hog industry expansion that got me going in the first place back then. What's going on in Manitoba right now, and what makes you write about this issue, I should say again, like it's come up again?
Right. Well, I could set the scene. I was living happily on an acreage around 2000 when a network of factory farms were planned for my area, so I got involved as an activist then. And now, so it's all sort of coming back. I could set the scene as to what has happened recently, of course.
Sure, yeah.
This past October, I believe it was, the Government of Manitoba passed a bill which, among other things, makes it easier for hog producers to build more barns and expand existing ones. It does this by changing or relaxing regulations, which critics say protect our very health and environment. For example, owners will no longer be required, as they were under the previous government, to install sophisticated devices called anaerobic digesters to treat the waste these animals produce.
Now, hogs produce a lot of manure, and it's liquid, isn't it?
Yes, it's called slurry. It's mixed with water and then sprayed on farm fields as fertilizer. So the problem was according to the industry, that these devices were so expensive that it amounted to a moratorium on new barns because they just couldn't afford them.
So they can't afford to make a profit with this anaerobic digester that helps break down some of the manure before it's sprayed on the fields?
Yes, I'm not an engineer, but it is a device that works in the absence of oxygen, and microbes break down the waste and turn it into a less toxic product.
Now, you're just. I'm going to change topics just for a sec. By comparison, this just reminds me of under the previous government. Didn't they also relax some environmental rules up in Swan River with the Strandboard plant just to allow the profitability that the company was claiming? It sounds like a very similar government-industry relationship where they're taking the word of industry that they can't be profitable with environmental protection, so they just remove the environmental protection. Is there any analog there for you, Larry?
Yeah, I think there's quite a parallel there. That you're referring to the Strawboard plants, I believe.
Yeah.
Near Swan River.
Exactly.
Where that was the NDP government at the time.
Right.
Agreed with the company to they could close down their pollution treatment facilities.
Right.
I forget what they were called.
Yeah.
The company claimed they're too expensive.
So are these new are hog plants that already have this anaerobic digester removing them, or is it just new buildings are not required them? Do you know?
I honestly don't know how many barns operate with anaerobic digesters, if any. But yes, you're right. They're no longer required. Under the previous legislation, you had to install them if you want to build or expand a new barn, and under the new act, you do not. So as a result, the industry expects perhaps up to 100 new barns will be built in this province over the next 10 years. Now, another change I could tell you about is the government has moved us closer to allowing producers to spread that liquid waste on fields in the wintertime. This has been banned up until now, and critics fear that if that's allowed, more of that toxic waste, rather than being absorbed by the crops, will run off into our waterways and contaminate them.
What's the logic in allowing this runoff? Was there a cost to storing the manure slurry over the winter? Why would they change this regulation? Well,
that's true. There would be a cost because, yes, if you couldn't spread it on the fields, you'd have to store it somewhere. And I believe the smaller producers especially were complaining that this was a hardship on them because they couldn't get rid of it.
So,
but the big danger, if I may, Alon, to me, is the aspect of antibiotic use. Now, what the bill does not change is the dangerous practice of giving antibiotics to animals raised for food, and this includes chickens and cattle as well as pigs. But for some time, the industry here in Manitoba and all over the world has given antibiotics to their animals. Number one, if they're sick. Number two, to prevent disease from happening. And number three, to help them grow faster so they fetch more money in the marketplace.
So when you talk about a barn, let's just remind people, we're not talking about a pastoral little 20 or 30 or even 100 hog operation. How big are these plants, just for people coming in on ground level with the hog industry in Manitoba?
Well, each building can hold thousands, like 1,500 up to 3,000. They're huge. They're and often overcrowded, and a lot of people smarter than me say that that is sort of a breeding ground for disease, and it's just not a healthy way to produce animals for food.
Is this a global standard, using this much antibiotics, or is this still very much a North American obsession based on the scale and the confinement and the intense numbers, the density of these barns?
Well, the factory farm concept, or as they're called, intensive livestock operations, were, I believe, pioneered in North America and Europe, but they've certainly been copied now around the world, and so has antibiotic use. It's common practice around the world, and ironically, the bill that Manitoba passed, which will, common sense would tell us that there's going to be more barns, more hogs, and more antibiotic use. It happened 3 days after the World Health Organization issued its most urgent warning yet against the way antibiotics are overused and abused, because 80% of antibiotics in Canada are used in livestock, in animal agriculture, as opposed to human medications. And they promote the growth of the so-called superbugs, which mean that a human with an infection, the normal treatments that have been used, the antibiotics used to clear up that infection, no longer work because those superbugs are resistant. And this is expected to, if there's no curb on this practice, this is going to cost lives, like not just thousands or tens of thousands, but millions of deaths. This is an estimate from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
OECD, yeah.
Put out pretty alarming figures.
Can I ask you a little more about the dynamic? How do these bugs that are super resistant mainly spread? Is it like through the meat itself? Is it through the waterways? Is it through the workers just being in touch with the animals? What's the biggest danger that you know of?
Well, according to World Health Organization, it is through the consumption of the meat, and it also can happen through close contact by the humans or barn workers with the animals.
Right. So, like, what can people do if they want to avoid? Is it really just stopping to consume mass-produced pork? Is it, what'll it take to turn this around? Is it a consumer outcry, you think, or is it going to take doctors? Who's leading the charge in potentially even, like, how well known is this issue even? I know we've talked about antibiotics in the Green Movement for quite a few years. And now we're not seeing any changes, and there are global warnings.
Yes.
What will it take to reach the next level?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there definitely is. There are voices calling for more different ways of producing meat, either through organic methods or at least reducing the use of antibiotics. But those voices seem to be crowded out by the clamor of governments that can see only one way of doing things, and that seems to be what's happening in Manitoba.
Well, who are government? I mean, government must be listening to Manitoba Pork. It must be coming from the lobby itself.
Oh, for sure, yes.
Now, the margin is very small on profit, I suppose, if they're going to the length they are to deregulate some aspects of the industry just for profit. It must be a very, very thin margin selling pigs in Manitoba.
Yeah.
Do you want to speak a little bit about what you perceive to be the economics of it and how that's interrelated with these practices of basically treating these animals as profit units one by one?
Well, I'm not an economist. All I could say to that is that I do know that High Life, which has its killing plant in Nipois, seems to be booming. It's shipping its product to Japan, to China, to the U.S. It's just undergone a $100 million expansion, so that seems to me to be a fairly profitable industry. So the question becomes, how big is big enough? How many more? Because we've got lots of barns in Manitoba now, and have for some time. We're the third largest province in pork production in the country.
Right. I remember one time in the peak of the hog industry's last wave, which was in the early part of the century, 2000, 2001, around there, 2002, 3, 4. I think it took quite a few years before the NDP even got the government even regulated the industry in any meaningful way. Like you said, the anaerobic digesters. There were a lot of big spills of manure into the waterways about 10, 15 years ago.
Yes.
There were about 4 million hogs at one point, I believe was the number. Do you have any sense of the scale of the industry right now? Was it scaled back? Because I understood the market had a little bit of a crash, or was it related to any of the diseases that were spreading?
Yes, well, that has happened, all right. And you're right about the previous government. They finally came around, but it took them a long time to realize, and they, what some activists, environmentalists have been saying for a long time, that there are dangers here. There are dangers to the environment. There are dangers to water pollution. And so the government did use its environmental, what's the commission called?
Clean Environment Commission, yeah.
To hold hearings. It concluded that, yes, hog waste was a big concern in relation to water quality. And that's when they started to clamp down a bit.
My guest today is Larry Powell, independent journalist, activist, blogger. His website is Planet in Peril. And Larry, you're in the midst of a 3-part series about the return of the hog industry in Manitoba. I believe your first piece was on the antibiotic threat. The second one about sort of the subsidies that the government is giving to the industry. That's
correct, yes. Although I think it was you who reminded me, maybe subsidies, I'm not sure of the meaning of that. What I wrote my piece about was taxpayer money that has been flowing to the industry, either nationally or provincially, in one form or another, whether it's in the form of a loan, like a free interest loan, or a loan with interest, or I find it. Do you want me to go into that a bit?
Sure. Let's talk a little bit about the economics of it, because I think, citizens need to know where their tax dollars are going, which industries are being supported, and the health and the environmental effects of such subsidies, because those are the kinds of things they can sort of lean on governments to try to reverse or change.
Mm-hmm. Well, I did some research onto how much money has flowed into into the industry through government contributions, and I tallied up a total, and I may have missed some, but a total of over $500 million, like over $500 million in the past 10 years. Now, your listeners can maybe decide whether or not they feel that amount is excessive or not. But one interesting point I learned, I was checking into High Life Foods, and they were the recipient of a $10 million loan from the federal government in 2011, I guess. And so I thought, well, the company seems to be doing well. Wouldn't it be interesting to find out how they're doing with their repayments, if it is in fact a loan? So I asked the government. They wouldn't tell me, so I launched an access to information request. And yes, I found out that they were not required to pay interest, which wasn't that surprising. That's not uncommon, interest-free loans, I guess. But the interesting part came, the documents I obtained were heavily redacted, but what they did say was they described the transaction as conditionally repayable, a conditionally repayable contribution. And it went on to say further, it allows the minister to grant the company more time to repay or even to release it from any term, condition, or obligation that may apply. Now, that loan isn't due for another 6 years, so does this mean they may not have to pay anything back? And I got back to the government and asked them to clarify, and I just haven't heard something else. I haven't heard anything more from. So wouldn't it be interesting to know that are these, when they say they're making a loan, that it is a loan, or what else it might be? There was another one that stood out too, a $5 million loan to Maple Leaf Foods a few years ago. It was in a year, and I'm sure it wasn't the only year, that the CEO of Maple Leaf Foods, Michael McCain, made $6 million in his salary, which was $1 million more than the loan amounted to. So he might have made that loan himself and still come out all right.
Right. I think corporations have certainly done a good job of separating the wealth of the individuals involved with their, they're like basically quite rich individuals, but when it comes to tax dollars, they're beggars, aren't they?
Yes. Well, Maple Leaf was in just recent weeks it was revealed that they own an offshore account similar to ones that are used to avoid taxes at home. So
you're talking about the Paradise Papers or the Panama?
That's correct. That's correct. Yes.
Yeah. So this is, you're painting an overall bleak picture, and that the fact is, these industries are receiving government money. They're making huge profits. We're not sure if they're paying the money back or if they have to at least pay interest. We're concerned about the spread of antibiotics through the overuse of antibiotics because of the intensity of the confinement of the animals. And overall, it's not helping our waterways, all that slurry being spread on the fields, right?
Well, it's been documented in many ways, many times, about the pollution that is created by animal agriculture. And
is there no way for them to, can they not compost? Can they not fix that nitrogen in the waste, or is it just too voluminous and too intensively confined an area for them to add enough carbon to make it, to neutralize the nitrogen that otherwise is running off into the waters? And now you say the government's going to allow the spreading of this liquid slurry in the winter as well, when can't absorb anything, and it's going to all run off in the winter or in the spring. What's your sense of that? Like, have they tried? Do you know? Have you heard of any efforts to mitigate that?
No, I'm afraid I can't really speak to that. Although the industry will tell you that the waste simply doesn't escape, which is a pretty preposterous statement. I have a section on that if I can find it in front of me here.
Well, let's take a short little musical break anyhow, because
sure.
This is usually when our show starts, 5:30. So we'll put a little music break in for 90 seconds, and we'll come back and we'll wrap up the interview in the next 10 minutes. We've got a few other things to touch on in this show, but I appreciate your insight into this industry, all right? So we'll come back in a couple of minutes. My guest is Larry Powell. We're discussing the hog industry in Manitoba on Rogue Primate, 95.9 FM. This is Tom Waits with Earth Died Screaming. Stay tuned for a little more of our interview. Screaming by Tom Waits off of Bone Machine on Rogue Primate, 95.9 FM, CKUW, local campus and community radio. My guest today is Larry Powell. We've been talking about the hog industry in Manitoba and how it's rearing its stinky face again, supported by government subsidy and deregulation of environmental rules. You there still, Larry?
I sure am, yes.
Thank you so much for bearing with us today, as we had a few issues at the top of the hour. And let's just ask you a little more about, what's happening and just the overall arc of the hog industry in Manitoba. Did we cover the economics enough, or is there anything else you wanted to add about?
I had planned to move on to the pollution aspects and.
One of the issues is that part of the problem is the intense confinement. Do you want to say something about, you called the plant in Nipo not an abattoir, not a slaughterhouse, but a killing barn, a killing center. What's your sense on the way we're treating animals in this province and in this industry?
Oh, yes. It's euphemistically called a pork processing plant, but yes. It in fact is where, thousands of animals are really butchered each day. That's what it is. But would you like to move on to the humane aspect then?
Absolutely, yeah. Let's get into that. I know in the foodie community, the urban foodie community, maybe rural as well, bacon has had a resurgence, a real renaissance among younger people in their 20s and 30s. People wear T-shirts that say bacon. Bacon is a big deal again, and I wonder if people are thinking about where the bacon's coming from and sort of the nature of the industry that they're indirectly supporting. What are your thoughts on it?
Yes, it does make you wonder if they really are aware of the conditions that do exist on the ground in our real world. Now, I would like to quote a person here, Janine Gibson, who is an organic food inspector. She's also trained in the humane care of farm animals. Ms. Gibson has been into these barns and says the real torture happens when pregnant sows are confined to cramped steel cages for long periods of time, where they often go insane because they can barely turn around and lack time with family groups. Then there's the question of tail docking. I don't know how familiar your listeners would be with that. It's just as it would imply, where barn operators cut the tails off the animals to keep them from biting each other. Ms. Gibson says if the pigs lived in better conditions with more room and straw to root around in, tail docking wouldn't be needed at all in the first place. In her words, I always knew it was wrong and caused more suffering than operators believed. I was once inspecting a barn wanting humane certification when the docking of 6 batches of 2-week-old piglets had just occurred. The walls of their pens were smeared with blood, as were all the piglets, obviously in pain and suffering. I had to leave the barn, and it is the only time in 24 years I have had to stop an inspection. Ms. Gibson says tail docking is not at all uncommon, and anesthetics are rarely used. And scientific research has shown, perhaps not surprisingly, that the practice causes real, immediate, and lasting pain in the animals, especially the piglets. Now, if you want to stick with that same...
Yeah, go ahead. I want to elaborate on that.
Sure.
I understood that in Europe, for example, these rules, there are rules to make it more humane to raise the animals in open pen design. I also know there was a pig farmer, Kate Story, who I think presented to the Clean Environment Commission around 2008 and 9 on the economics of raising animals in a more open, and how, you can charge more, the meat is better, and then you just go for fewer in numbers.
Right. Well, I should mention there is talk of a move by that industry will phase out the steel cages or the gestation crates.
What they call sow crates, right?
Yes, in about 7 years.
I can't understand how 7 years, it's almost like we're moving about as slowly as we have been since the Kyoto Accord came in on climate change.
Yeah.
This is these sow crates. I used to table back around 2003 and 4 for environmental groups over when they had their environmental awareness weeks at the university, and these sow crates were being brought by the Humane Society 15 years ago to tables. And 7 years? Is this a voluntary thing or a regulation?
Yeah, I don't know much more about that aspect of it, and I'm not sure if it's a hard and fast commitment by the industry, but there is that dialogue taking place apparently.
So on the whole, we're reviewing a lot with regards to that industry, the economics and the government money flowing into it, the concern about antibiotics, the maltreatment of these animals that are otherwise quite sociable and intelligent in nature. And then there's the concern over our waterways and the slurry being put on the land, and especially in the winter now. What aspect really piques your interest and your concern the most as someone who's been following the industry for quite a while?
Well, the pollution is a big problem, and I'd say that it's been widely known and documented for years and years. And for any reasonable person, It has to be compelling, the facts and the evidence. A few examples here. I'd like to give you a brief quote from the Royal Society in 2012. The Royal Society happens to be a fellowship of many of the world's most eminent scientists and is the oldest scientific academy in continuous existence. And here's what it says. Cultural eutrophication is the Earth's most widespread water quality problem. It being cultural eutrophication, causes harmful algal blooms, fish kills, and many related problems both in freshwaters and in coastal seas that are adjacent to areas with large human populations. Most scientists agree that it is largely caused by increasing inputs of phosphorus and nitrogen, which are abundant in human sewage, in the excrement of livestock, and in synthetic fertilizers applied to agricultural lands. Now, to contrast this with the discourse that's been happening here, here's what George Matheson, the chair of Manitoba Pork, the industry mouthpiece in this province, told a legislative committee recently. Manure does not get into rivers and lakes. In fact, it is illegal for manure to leave a field. In which case, I would suggest that there's some illegal activity going on somewhere. 5 years ago, Professor Eva Pipp and a colleague from the biology department at University of Winnipeg did a study. They placed sensors both upstream and downstream of a small hog and poultry operation in southeastern Manitoba, complete with waste lagoons and fields where the waste was sprayed. The farm was located between the Broken Head River and one of its tributaries. The study detected significantly higher levels of phosphorus, solid, chlorine, and nitrate at the downstream monitors compared to those upstream above the operation. The conclusion, these materials were running off from the spread fields and the farm into the adjacent streams. And here's how Professor Pipp describes her study. Our study of Hazel Creek and the Broken Head River demonstrated unequivocally that manure was getting into these waterways from the spread fields after the manure had been spread, and not just small amounts either. Now, I guess the question becomes, who would you believe here? All this credible science, or a representative of big vertically integrated corporations, which the Manitoba Pork represents, who stand to make a lot of money from the mass production of pork.
Yeah, no, it's something more urban folks, consumers, citizens alike need to take interest in. I just want to ask you one more question as we sort of wind down the interview, Larry. I think you hinted when we spoke last night about an anecdote or a story you might like to share. I know you're not just a journalist and a blogger, but an activist as well, in the sense that you have been covering some of these issues for some time. I know people in the agriculture industry can get very defensive sometimes when their practices are called into question by people who don't work in the industry. Have you ever had any run-ins with people in the industry while you were investigating their practices, or has it all been from a distance?
Only one that I can recall in all the years. It was a fellow who actually worked for a hog company, and I had appeared at my local council on the issue of the new network of hog factories they were planning, and in opposition. And he came up to me at the break and suggested that I was an outsider, because actually it was a place I was born and grew up in, but I had been away and worked for quite a number of years before going back there. So it was ironic that he was objecting to me, even though the company that was behind these barns was from Denmark. So it got kind of hot, but nothing more became of that.
Do you sense, are the producers families that are any of these family businesses anymore, or have they gotten so large that they're corporate, maybe coming out of family businesses?
Oh, I'm sure they are family. Some of them family owned. the ones, other than, like High Life owns its own barns as well, its own production barns where the hogs are raised, as well as, the slaughterhouse part of it. But others they're individuals, farmers and so on. And of course it needs to be said that, in fairness, that the industry does produce jobs and brings in considerable revenue. I think according to the industry, it's something like over $1 billion a year, and it employs, people into the thousands. I have no way of, I don't know how accurate those figures are. I'm sure they're close.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it's something that we need to keep an eye on. I imagine for the folks at Hogwatch Manitoba, it feels like deja vu all over again in terms of the hog industry. I think what happened in the 90s was NAFTA came in and the crow rate was canceled, and it really affected a lot of inland farmers. And so they looked for a quick fix for agricultural business, and the hog industry came calling. Manitoba's pretty much a marine province, like it's water all through, and I just don't understand the provincial government is trying to pass a water stewardship, a new water sustainability act of sorts, while at the same time pushing through these regulations. It boggles the mind, frankly. Well,
I could see the irony in an announcement that was just made a couple of weeks ago of new federal funding, I believe, to clean up Lake Winnipeg, and they talked about this new money in total isolation from what the government of Manitoba had just done.
Right. Well, it's the same with the carbon tax, and then they cut the transit subsidy here in Winnipeg as well. They're announcing the carbon tax, and meanwhile they cut the subsidy to transit. So it's really incoherent at times, isn't it? Do you ever get pessimistic or down? It's a grim business reporting on environmental degradation.
Yeah, it is, and I know some of my friends tell me maybe I should put more good news on my blog, and I guess sometimes I tell them, well, if the body of evidence supports the good news outlook, I'll start doing it.
Well, we're always.
But I guess I wouldn't be doing it if I was totally cynical. I wouldn't keep writing, I suppose.
Right. Well, the name of our show is Rogue Primate, and we've come to accept to a certain degree that humanity is somewhat stumbling blindly through it all, but we also like to report on ways in which we can at least redesign our systems to be more sane. So we're happy to exchange information with you, eyes and ears of rural Manitoba up in the Neepawa Shoal Lake area. Larry Powell, thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure, Alon.
And you'll be welcome to come back again if you have another issue you're working on, or just give us an update on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Rogue Primate. I've sent you the link today. And I've also posted an article for our listeners, both yours, but now another one from The Independent, just about antibiotics in our meat. So something to think about.
Sounds good. Thanks so much.
You've given us a lot to chew on and not to chew on, so to speak. Thanks, Larry.
Bye-bye now.
You take care. Bye-bye.